It's Monday morning at work. You're just getting settled in when you hear a commotion. It's one of your colleagues who appears to be having a fight with the coffee maker. But later on, a heated argument breaks out, provoked by the same coworker. Fortunately, that gets resolved, although the erratic behavior continues for much of the day and the rest of the week, and the weeks that follow. Is this just a very grumpy colleague, or someone who actually poses a security risk?
We found that these people would express views that were very narrowly focused, very rejectionist of any other views that weren't consistent with their own.
Phil Gursky is a former analyst at the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, where he investigated how people become radicalized and carry out acts of terrorism. He's currently the CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting.
What are the chances that an act of terrorism can take place on my watch? 1 in a bazillion. But it's 1 in a bazillion, not 0 in a bazillion.
We'll chat about warning signs that could be indicative of troubling behavioral changes, how to help someone before they become a threat, and why you need to be discreet when collecting information so a potentially volatile situation doesn't get any worse.
The earlier you get people involved, the greater the chance, in theory, that you should be able to de-escalate before it gets too bad.
Hi there, I'm Tristan Field-Jones, and once again, welcome to SitRep. Phil Gursky joins us now, and Phil, you have quite a fascinating backstory, especially considering your previous experience with CSIS. Tell us more about the work you did in intelligence and what happened after retiring from the service.
Sure. So thanks, first of all, Tristan, for having me on the podcast. It's a real honor. I did spend 32 years in intelligence in Canada, and prior to joining CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, I was actually with a much more secretive organization called Communication Security Establishment, or CSE, which is Canada's Signals Intelligence Organization. I'm not going to talk an awful lot about that because it is so ultra sensitive, but I did join CSIS in January of 2001. I came over as a specialist in Middle East affairs. I was a multilingual analyst with CSE, which has a function to essentially capture and process foreign signals to extract intelligence. And my specialization caught the eye of the service, as we call it. I went over there. And as somebody who looked at the Middle East, was fluent in Arabic, was fluent in Farsi, you can imagine I kind of fit in well 9 months after my arrival, when, of course, 4 planes were hijacked, 3 of them flown into buildings in Washington, New York. And we saw, of course, 9/11, the greatest act of terrorism in history, and knock on wood, hopefully never to be surpassed as a much greater act of terrorism in history. Mm-hmm. And my job with CSIS was to understand the mindset of what we call Islamist terrorism. Some call them jihadis. It's been around for many, many decades. It has not gone away. And what I tried to do is work alongside the investigators. They're called intelligence officers, or IOs, with CSIS, who do look into potential risks here in Canada. And often a lot of the information that they would collect would be sort of, down my alley. It would be, what is Islamist extremism? What are people saying? What are they posting? What are they writing? How do they feel about things? And so I developed an expertise, or specialization rather, in what we call radicalization to violence. How is it that a normal Canadian or American or Israeli or Omani or whatever goes down a path where they begin to imbibe, incorporate more and more violent material and ideology that at the end of the day convinces them it's not now my turn to fly a plane into a building or pick up a knife in a crowded shopping center or strap on a suicide vest and walk into a school or a synagogue or a mosque, whatever. So that's what I did. And in early 2015, I decided that 32 years was enough. I had a lot more I wanted to do. And so since my retirement in April of 2015, I've written 6 books on terrorism, all of which have been published. And the very first one, which I think will be of the greatest interest for our purposes today, is called The Threat from Within, Recognizing Al-Qaeda-Inspired Radicalization in the West. And that's essentially what I learned about this process where people will morph from just average members of the family, neighbors, schoolmates, workmates, whatever, into people that plan and execute acts of terrorism here or abroad.
And that will really guide our discussion today, because we will be focusing not even just on the term radicalization, but determining how someone poses an actual threat
Right.
versus a bad day, and lots of aspects to cover in terms of that. One of the questions I have right off the top here involves the term radicalized.
Mhm.
We associate that, I think a lot of us associate that with terrorist groups. But when someone poses a threat, are they always radicalized?
It was generally speaking my finding that people who did engage in this type of activity did go through some kind of a transformation, i.e., they were exposed to certain ideologies, they were led by the hand or by the brain to consume this information. It was often explained to them what this information meant, what it was calling upon them to do. And at the end of the day, they agreed and embraced it and were convinced to either carry out an act or plan an act on their own. This is not to say that every single person who ends up being a terrorist has gone through an analogous process. I think the vast majority do, but there simply are cases of people who are not necessarily radicalized in the generic sense of the word, but decide to lash out violently, and sometimes it's in reaction to something. So if you've just seen something on your TV screen, let's look what's happening in Ukraine right now. We have a lot of people who are seeing alleged Russian war crimes against Ukrainian civilians. I happen to be half Ukrainian. My mother's family immigrated to Ukraine in the early part of the 20th century to Canada. It isn't completely beyond comprehension that I would, wake up in the morning and think, my God, I need to seek retribution for my family and my family's family from what Russia's doing in Ukraine. And, then I drive into Ottawa from my home here in Russell. And, I chuck rocks at the Russian embassy on Charlotte Street in downtown Ottawa as my way of registering my vote against what they're doing. I can't say I was radicalized to do that. I'm simply angry at what's happening, and I want to register my own opposition to what has just taken place. So I do think it's possible for someone to engage in a serious act of violence, not having been through this process, as we say. It's not a great word, but it's what we have of radicalization. But I do think the vast majority of people have, in fact, gone through some kind of a change whereby they reject what we would call normative mainstream views of whatever and adopt more peripheral fringe, and in the case of terrorism, more violent interpretations of a faith, of a political system, or whatever.
So, what should the security framework and documentation look like when dealing with people who may pose a threat? I'm not necessarily speaking about a specific instance, but when you formulate these security plans, be it if you work at a major corporation or a government bureau, wherever it may be, how should radicalization and terrorism play a role in those security plans?
Let me start with a lesson I learned, Tristan. I talked to a lot of people, a lot of families of largely young men, but not exclusively men and not exclusively young, who'd gone off and tried to do something here in Canada or successfully did so or went abroad. I talked to the mothers of young Canadians who killed themselves in terrorist attacks outside of Canada. And I would constantly hear, and you see this in the media as well. So, intrepid reporter asks, Mrs. Smith, why did your son go off and blow himself up? And the inevitable response that I would get, and I see this happening in the media, is never saw it coming. That's not my son. I don't know what happened. And yet the more you probe, you find out, but yeah, over the past 3 months, my son was undergoing some changes. He would say and do things he wouldn't normally say or do. And to me, as someone who worked on hundreds of cases here in Canada, that was the key, is that there were indications, there were signs that something was afoot, something was being transformed. Those signs are signs of violent radicalization. So from whether you're in corporate security or you're working for the CSIS or the RCMP or the Canadian military or whatever, the key, as far as I'm concerned, is what are those signs? What are they indicative of? And as a security service, we have the legislative mandate through the CSIS Act to undertake investigations into threats to national security as defined by Section 2 of the CSIS Act, which allowed us to collect information on what were we seeing, and we could say, what do we think it means? And so we developed basically a checklist. What is it that somebody who is going down this pathway and may or may not, and I'll get back to that in a second, actually plan or execute an act of terrorism, how do you detect it before it actually takes place? And the beauty was that with very rare exceptions, the evidence was right in front of your nose. So the things that people said, the way they treated their siblings, their parents, their friends, their teachers, their religious leaders, you could see that they were slowly, or in some cases not so slowly, rather rapidly, adopting versions of ideologies, versions of faith that were very inimical and very different than what they've been brought up with. And those things were blatantly true. And the way that I express it, Tristan, the way that I understand it, it's almost as if that once you start drinking this Kool-Aid, if I can use that term, it so empowers you and it so overtakes you that it's like you can't not talk about it. You can't not manifest it because it becomes sort of the end all and the be all to you. So once you're aware of these types of signs, you can at least say to yourself, okay, something's going on here. Is it going to end up with a guy putting on a suicide vest or taking out a knife in a shopping mall? I don't have the answer to that. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict that. But at a minimum, what it should do is lead you to say, okay, what's going on here? And, further to what discussions you and I have had, is this just a kid having a bad day? And we all have them. We all snap at people and say things we regret later. Or is this more emblematic of a longer process? Is it happening more often than not? And I would argue that if you see it happening over a period of time, that should warrant much, much more attention than if it's just, okay, it's Monday morning. I had a bender on the weekend. I'm not feeling well. I don't want to be here at work. You can kind of dismiss that. But if things are a little more systematic and a little more frequently expressed, then the bare minimum as an employer, of course, you want to have happy employees. You don't want employees to affect the attitudes, the behaviors, and output of your other employees. So at a minimum, you should be saying, okay, what's gotten into Phil today? And is this something which is emblematic of something more? In the same way that if you saw behaviors that were indicative of deep depression or suicidal thoughts, you wouldn't ignore them. You'd want to get the person help before something bad happens. No one wants someone to kill themselves at their desk and on a Wednesday afternoon in front of everybody else. Well, if you don't want that, then why would you want someone to carry a knife into a shopping center and start stabbing people randomly?
You talked about that checklist that was designed to look for potential signs of threats. Talk about that checklist. What did it look like? What were the questions or the points that were on there?
Right. So again, I'm going to narrowly focus on Islamist terrorism, but I could almost make these things a little more generic, and I'll try a little bit if I can. What we found with people who were adopting what we used to call the Al-Qaeda ideology, but that's not the greatest term, but basically it's called Islamist terrorism. We found that these people would express views that were very narrowly focused, very rejectionist of any other views that weren't consistent with their own. So for example, Islamist terrorists believe that they have a monopoly on Islamic truth. So anybody who disagrees with them is immediately labeled as an enemy. The other thing is that they're really big on grievances, and they'd be angry at something. And then we also one really important indicator was people's social circles began to contract. As you become more and more intolerant in your views and more rejectionist of the views of others, what you tend to do is you tend to only associate with those people who are like you. And this is what recruiters do really well. And I'll cite you an example. You've probably heard the same thing with cult members, religious cults. What do cult leaders do really well? They take you away from your family and friends, and you get to the point where you have no contact with them. And therefore, what that does is it does two things. It kind of hermetically seals you in a bubble. And what that does is within that bubble, outside messages can't penetrate. So you're not getting any other alternative version of the world or history or grievance or whatever kind of thing. At the same time, when you're within that bubble, the only messages you are getting are the ones that reinforce what the person's trying to do. So it's kind of like you're being bombarded with this ideology, and you have no wherewithal to counteract it. You have no tools to say, yeah, hang on a second here. I read the same scriptural verse and I didn't get that interpretation. And by the way, I was talking to my local religious leader last week, and he told me, well, you're not talking to your local religious leader because you're hermetically sealed in that bubble. And people, recruiters, and we used to call them radicalizers, they know that. And that's exactly what they do, is they basically want to separate you from any other influence that can go against what they're trying to do. So those are the kinds of things that we saw. They become engrossed and obsessed with what's happening in country X or country Y. And that's all they want to talk about. And as a consequence, they find themselves going along a pathway where they simply don't express any views that are not consistent with the violent views that they're being fed. And that makes intervention really tough. And we'll talk a little bit about that thing later. But the bottom line is that if you see these types of things, they are very worrisome warning signs. If nothing else, we're talking about people who estrange themselves from family and friends. If you're on the outside, you don't have to be an expert or a specialist in what the signs mean. All you have to do is open your eyes and ears to what you're seeing around you. And again, if your son or daughter or best friend or spouse or whatever is exhibiting behaviors that are completely out of the norm for that person, wouldn't you be asking the questions as to why? Is this something physical? Is my father going through some kind of a health crisis that might indicate why he's changed his personality? Or is it something else? So the signs are there. It's just a matter of appreciating them for what they mean.
So let's apply this to a security context. And again, we do want to be careful here because, like you said, we don't want to punish someone who's just having a bad day. And we've had a lot more bad days recently thanks to the pandemic, thanks to unrest, thanks to so many other factors. But what are some possible early warning signs that someone may become a risk to colleagues? You mentioned several factors there, but what would be something early, and maybe not something where it's like, wow, he or she, they're harming themselves, but something where it's like, that's a bit off?
To complicate matters about what you're asking me is the other reality is that the vast majority of people who do engage in these behaviors, adopt these ideologies, never do anything violent. It's not a one-to-one relationship. And I certainly worked on cases where we would legitimately follow someone in accordance with our legislation. We had the legal authority to do so. And after a period of time, whatever the period of time that is, it would be determined that that person simply doesn't have any real intention to doing anything that would constitute a threat to national security or public safety. And you can't always predict that. It only starts to become worrisome if people really start to engage in behaviors or start alluding to things that can actually point to potential acts of violence. And again, I'm going to stress potential because, again, there's no one-to-one mapping in this kind of thing. I'm sorry I'm not being concrete enough for your listeners, but it really is tough to come up with a specific set of things that, if you're flashing red on 4 to 5 things, oh my God, it's time to call 911. It rarely works that way. It's just a matter of being patient and seeing if people do consistently raise the same issues. And if in raising those issues, they're going down a pathway where it's becoming more and more worrisome, that they're going from objectionable, but still a legit activity. I mean, you have a right to express differences in society, to ones where there's a reasonable suspicion that in fact, this is going down a pathway that could end in an act of violence, either against a fellow employees or beyond that.
What would be some of your thoughts in terms of handling these situations delicately, especially in the early days? Nowadays, we put a lot of emphasis on mental health. We put a lot of emphasis on, or you would hope at least, on understanding the complexities of human beings. Like you mentioned, maybe someone's going through divorce. Maybe they lost a loved one. There's a lot of things like that. But if something arises where it's enough to alert the security team and the security team has to get involved in whatever context, as a professional, without getting into being a psychologist or other roles you're not supposed to do, but just from a security standpoint, how do you handle this in a delicate manner without making the situation worse?
I would see it's more of just, taking the very careful note of what these changes are, what these behaviors and attitudes are, and mapping to see exactly where they're going and how are they changing, or is this is Phil. This is the way Phil is, and we all have our quirks and things that we do that we probably shouldn't do. But it's a matter of not being too confrontational too soon, because again, if you're overblowing a situation, you've created a problem. And in some ways, if a person truly is going on a pathway and you've kind of tipped your hand saying we're kind of aware of what you're doing, then you could potentially get a person to start acting a little more secretively in a way that you wouldn't find out as much. Although, again, in my experience, once people are so far down this pathway, they're so um, overfilled with this ideology, they can't help but share it. It's really hard for them to hide. So it's really a matter of just of being very observant and taking into account what people are saying. And the other thing that's really important here, and goes back to my intelligence days, the key to determining if information is worth noting down is corroboration. So let's say, for example, you and I work for the same company. I happen to be your supervisor. You can't stand me. So you'll say, you wouldn't believe what Phil's been telling me and sending me over the past 4 or 5 weeks. And a lot of it will be completely made up because you want me to get in trouble, maybe I'll get fired and you get my job kind of thing. You're a single source. You're the only person reporting this kind of thing. Single sources are anathema to an intelligence service or law enforcement for the simple reason that single sources can lie for all kinds of reasons. I'm having a dispute with my neighbor. His fence is two centimeters on my property. Well, I got to make up something so I can call the cops on my neighbor kind of thing. So you want to try and see if this is actually can be replicated across multiple sources independently. And if that's the case, then you probably do have a problem. So you've got several colleagues saying, yeah, Phil's been really changing over the last 6 to 8 weeks. And these people don't know each other necessarily or don't work with each other. And they're noticing the same things. That's a lot more dependable than if just a one person is saying something for reasons that may be true, or maybe just their own vendetta or their own campaign against somebody. So it's a matter of trying to gather as much information as possible and keeping note of it and seeing what the changes are, how rapidly are the changes taking place. And it's getting to the point where maybe this is now beyond our purview. If it turns out, if you really think there's a serious potential of violence or some kind of illegal activity that your employee is going to engage in, that's a matter for the police. At that point, you have to turn it over to professionals and say, these are the things I've noted. I'm really worried about this. I don't want it to go down to the nth degree where someone gets hurt. I need to get you guys involved. And that's not an easy decision. I can imagine the last thing people want to do is bring in some kind of law enforcement. Because they could come in rather heavy-handedly, as sometimes happens. And then people start talking, whoa, why was there a cop at Phil's desk the other day kind of thing? And, why isn't he at work today? But on the other hand, what no one wants to have happen is, we're just going to let this slide for now. He's just been having a bad 6 months. And then you read in the paper, Phil walked into work on Monday morning with an AR-15 and started, wasting people at the coffee corner. That's not what you want. So again, I'm not trying to use, worst possible case scenario. I'm not trying to fearmonger here, but if you ignore things too long, you may find yourself in a situation where the worst possible outcome is what ensues.
You mentioned a little bit about being careful and being discreet when gathering information about someone who may or may not pose a threat, especially if you're in a large company or organization. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit more about that, Phil. How are you supposed to gather as much information as possible while being discreet so you don't you don't drive this person further into whatever ideology they may have adapted, and B, so that it doesn't get out and then suddenly maybe someone who's innocent feels like they're targeted? How do you go about that discreetness?
Well, that's a really, really tough question because, of course, I come from a world where discreetness is sort of de rigueur when you work in intelligence. Right. You don't want people to find out, what you're doing and how you're doing it. It's just a matter of being extremely careful. And I don't know, again, it'll be vary from company to company, but, people talk. So if people are concerned, if internal security is concerned about Phil and they go and talk to Tristan, there has to be a way to say, okay, look at Tristan. We just have a few questions for you. We want to talk about, your observations of what Phil's been up to the past little while. You've got to impress upon them that, we've got to keep this very, very quiet because if it gets out, a couple of things can happen. If it turns out to be nothing, Phil's career is shot. because everyone thinks he's doing something he shouldn't do. Secondly, if Phil gets wind of it, then I get and if and he figures out Tristan's the source, then while you could potentially be at harm. I could meet you in the parking lot one day and start wailing on you because I think you're trying to ruin my career, kind of thing. So I think you need to have the policies in place where you can say, look, we're just here to gather some information to determine if there's something we need to be worried about. And you act on people's discretion in the sense that we want you to share things with us, but please, please, please keep this between you and us because we don't want the situation to escalate.
So let's talk a little bit about, for lack of a better term, de-escalation. Now, I'm not talking specifically about when the crisis is happening. That's a whole separate issue. But let's say, as a security team, you've identified an employee who, there's enough there to say, okay, we need to do something. How do you, for lack of a better expression, talk them off the ledge? Yep. Because like you said, at some point, unfortunately, some people are just so far gone, there isn't much you can do. But how can you intervene and how can you get to that person before they end up in a state where you have to call police?
The best approach, Tristan, is multidisciplinary. Let me give you an example. I worked very closely with a police force, whom I shall not name, in Canada, in developing strategies to, when you come across cases like this, what do you need to do? And it was decided, and I think this is the best strategy, this particular force decided, well, okay, there'll be the law enforcement angle in cases where law enforcement is the appropriate response. Some cases, it's a mental health professional. In some cases, it's someone from the education sector. In some cases, it could be somebody from a spiritual angle to deal with somebody. In some cases, it could be a psychologist or a psychiatrist, maybe a medical doctor if there are underlying physical conditions. So in the course of gathering the information, you can determine, okay, we think it's X. And now if it's X, maybe this person can get involved at an early stage and have a chat with the person, give some guidance, listen to what's happening and have a dialogue with them. That's the best approach at the early phase is to gather as much information as possible so you can make the best determination. What is really going on here? Is it a family situation? Well, maybe you want to get a family counselor involved. Is Phil having, a tough time at school? Well, maybe you get guidance counselors or, teachers involved, kind of thing. Is he having a faith crisis or something like that? Well, then you get the priest, rabbi, imam, whatever kind of thing involved. So that points to why you want to gather as much information as quickly as you can to determine what are the factors at play here. Then once you determine what the factors are at play or what you think are the factors are at play, then you can identify who's the best person to do this. In all honesty, should law enforcement officers be providing marriage guidance? Probably not, because they're not paid to do that. They're not specialists. Should a parole officer be talking about religion? Probably not, because again, it's not their specialization. And the beauty is with some of the models that have been developed in Canada called hub models, HUB, is that they've gathered around the table people from a variety of streams of society who do have the specialization, who do have the skill sets, who can ask the right questions and provide the right advice to people. That, to me, is the best way about doing things. And again, the earlier you get people involved, the greater the chance, in theory, that you should be able to de-escalate before it gets too bad.
Okay. Phenomenal insight there, Phil. Now, I'm curious about maybe a broader aspect in terms of this. We know that terrorism happens around the world. I think a lot of people may sort of have the impression that in less stable regions, think the Middle East, parts of Africa, regions in Central and Southern America, just as some examples, terrorism might be more common there. But we also see, what they call lone wolf attacks in North America, in Europe. Like we see that everywhere. Now, let's say you're a security professional, but you don't work at a prominent corporation or a controversial organization or anything like that. You're based in a peaceful country. Why should you still factor in terrorism and similar extreme activities into your security plan, even if the chance of them happening is exceptionally low?
Because, as you said, it can happen anywhere. Let me give you a simple example, Tristan. This is an example that at least a lot of Canadians will have heard of. A couple of years ago, there was a young man who converted to Islam, and he ended up becoming radicalized. He ended up pledging allegiance to Islamic State. He made a video And then he got into a cab. He was on a peace bond, which is a vehicle or um, a mechanism that law enforcement can use to restrict your activities, because they found they don't actually charge you, but you're doing things you shouldn't be doing, and you might want to stop doing them, or else we will charge you. End up getting into a cab in, of all places, Strathroy, Ontario. Now, Strathroy, Ontario is a very, very small town in southwestern Ontario, kind of just northwest of where I grew up in London. And luckily, long story short, there was a tip off, and he was confronted by police, and he ended up, carrying. He had two bombs he had made, and not very good bombs. One detonated in the back of the cab, doing virtually no damage, and the second one detonated as he was out of the car, and he was shot dead by police. But Strathroy, Ontario. I mean, it's not Toronto, it's not Montreal, it's not New York, it's not Paris, it's not Tokyo. If it can happen in Strathroy, Ontario, it can happen anywhere. Now, chances are it's not going to happen in most places, but the fact is that it can. I think the challenge for security, and you're absolutely right, Tristan. I think if you're a smaller company, what are the chances that an act of terrorism is going to take place on my watch? 1 in a bazillion. But it's 1 in a bazillion, not 0 in a bazillion. So I think you have to identify how much should I keep up on this? And luckily, because of the wonder of the internet and the World Wide Web, open source information is available at the tip of a hat. If it can happen anywhere, then one would think that at least you have to pay some attention to it. And I'm not talking about obsession. I'm not talking about becoming the end all and the be all. You still have a greater chance of one of your employees getting angry at the lack of a promotion or whatever, having a bad day, and then, doing something dumb at the office on a Monday morning. Then you have somebody strapping on a suicide vest and walking into your your canteen and killing people. But the bottom line is that it is possible for that to happen, which I would say makes it incumbent upon you to at least be informed of the possibility. And again, not to put in draconian measures that are going to prevent your corporation from functioning. We're not, I'm not talking about pat downs and polygraphs and metal scanning every time you go into work in the morning. But there has to be some awareness that, yes, it is possible.
Terrific insight, Phil. Love the conversation. Just as we wrap up this discussion, what would be some advice? What's a big takeaway from what we've discussed for the security professional out there listening to this, if you had to try and summarize our conversation into the one big point to bring home?
Don't dismiss anything out of hand. So, again, going back, putting my security intelligence hat back on, you gather information for a reason. It's to determine, do I need to gather more information to understand what's happening here? Or do I know enough to make the determination this is a problem whereas that is not a problem? So you can gather information. And the other thing too, I would say, which is the other side of that, is when you're gathering information, be as open-minded as possible. Do not jump to conclusions right away. It could be just a bad day. It could be just, this is the guy's personality. So I think that you want to make sure that you have in place the procedures and resources necessary to gather the information you need. At the same time, give yourself the time to understand what it means. It's very, very rare, virtually almost non-existent, that you're going to have 8 minutes or 8 days to make a decision on this. Chances are it's going to be a little longer than that. So give yourself the time to gather the information, assess it for how true it is. We go back to the corroboration thing we talked about before, and simply gather enough information to make a determination about, what is happening here, what further action do I need to take, or do I decide that in this case, I'm satisfied with what I know, everything is probably going to be okay, never 100%, but probably, and I can move on to something else.
Okay. Phil, terrific conversation. Thanks again. Where can people go if they want to find out more about you and the work you do?
Sure. So my website is borealisthreatandrisk.com. So Borealis, as in the Northern Lights. That's where all my podcasts are, my blogs are. I also tweet. My Twitter handle is @BorealisSaves. There's a bit of a pun there because I've been a very bad goaltender in hockey, so I don't make a lot of saves, but my Twitter handle is @BorealisSaves. And also on my website, I'm also on LinkedIn and Facebook, and you'll find links there to all of my books. That people might be most interested in the most recent one, which is The Peaceable Kingdom, A History of Terrorism in Canada from Confederation to the Present. It's basically looking at how terrorism has unfolded in Canada over the past 150 odd years. as seen through the eyes of the men and women who work at CSIS and the RCMP.
All right. Phil Gursky is president and CEO of Borealis Threat and Risk Consulting and formerly worked for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. I'm Tristan Field-Jones. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email me at sitrep@samdesk.io or follow us on Twitter @samdeskofficial. Until next time, stay safe out there.